So the good news is we do chapter 18 tonight. That leaves 4 chapters, and if we can get a chapter done in each session, we're about 4 Sunday nights from being out of Revelation, which is good. So in that regard, be thinking about the reason we did Revelation was because it was requested. And so if there are requests you have related to studies you would like us to undertake on Sunday nights, please do. Also, if I was thinking in terms of there might be a Sunday night a month where we'd want to devote them to specific Bible questions that you have, so you could be submitting questions along. I know not too long ago, Gwenda sent me several questions, and so something like that I think we could do as well, as at least for part of it. Next Sunday night, of course, will be singing night, so we'll be singing next Sunday night, but we are getting close. The other good news that I have, right off the top, in Roper's introduction to chapter 18 of Revelation, he quotes a guy named Daniel Russell, and Russell says that this is one of the easiest chapters of the book to understand. Who thinks that's good news? Okay? So, that is, we like that, and so the message is Babylon is doomed. That's kind of the overriding thought that goes through this chapter. It's one of the great chapters of Revelation. He says, read aloud, this chapter is noble, beautiful, a terrible, impressive poem. It's a bit like a eulogy because you've got mourners stepping back and eulogizing the fall of the city. The details given in the chapter fit Rome perfectly. Additional proof that Babylon the Great in Revelation represents the city of Rome. Kester, when he introduces this, he refers to this chapter as Babylon's funeral. He says the vision of the demise of Babylon is followed by a lengthy dirge over the fallen city, a foretaste of Babylon's funeral. And one thing you'll notice as we read, for our English teachers, this chapter is a bit of a nightmare because the tenses are constantly changing. We're going to have Babylon has already fallen, verse 2, past tense. People are urged to come out of her, which assumes she's still standing. So it's, in the present tense, come out of her, verse 4. In verse 8, her fall is going to be described in future tense. The grief of kings is in future tense, verse 9. The grief of merchants is in present tense in verse 11. The grief of the shipmasters is in past tense in verse 18. And then the angel with the millstone speaks of it being in the future. And so again, an English teacher's nightmare in the way this chapter is written and put together. Roper says, well, maybe one reason it's this way is because judgment first takes place in the mind of God, and as far as he's concerned, the fall of Babylon was an accomplished fact. So it really, in that sense, it doesn't really matter how you talk about it. Could be, don't know. Kester compares this chapter to what happens in the well-known story of A Christmas Carol. And so if you know that story, it is shown in 3 visions. The first 2 being of Christmases past and present. Then in the third, this businessman they're discussing someone who's died. No real sympathy for the person who's died, but primarily a discussion of what's going to become of this guy's money. And of course, it shows the dregs of society preying like vultures on the dead man's property. Or if you've ever been in a big office setting, when somebody leaves the company, what happens to their work area? What do vultures do? Y'all ever been in a situation like that? If somebody leaves and their desk in that area is not occupied anymore, people swoop in like vultures. That's a great chair. I need that chair. And my stapler's horrible. I'm taking that. People swoop in and just claim stuff. And so you've got, in the story, people are preying like vultures on this dead man's property. And the people are rejoicing that their pitiless creditor's gone. Then he's taken to the graveyard and he realizes he's the guy. And so, he's like, well, why show me this if I'm past all hope? And so Kester holds that the depiction of Babylon's fall is designed to have a similar effect on people. They're taken to the graveyard where Babylon's name is inscribed in the rubble, and they're allowed to hear what people are saying about the fall of Babylon, about her downfall. They express grief. Their concern is mainly over the lamentable loss of her wealth, because the loss of her wealth means the loss of their wealth. And the oppressed have reason to rejoice, of course, over the demise of their pitiless master, because we will no longer be oppressed. And the point of it all is, readers need to be moved to renounce the arrogant and inhumane ways of injustice. And so Kester pulls a little bit of similarity there, if you know the story of A Christmas Carol, to what's going on here in chapter 18. So let's dive in. We'll look at the first 8 verses and then talk about them a little bit. And I think we can move through this chapter relatively rapidly. After these things, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illumined with his glory. And of course, authority, because of having come from God's presence, that's why the angel comes down with authority. And he cried out with a mighty voice, saying, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She's become a dwelling place of demons and a prison of every unclean spirit and a prison of every unclean and hateful bird." Judgment had been proclaimed earlier in the book, chapter 14, verse 8. Now the sentence is being carried out in the vision. And the scene is a bit of like that of an abandoned city. It's sad to me when you see a structure that's been abandoned. If you remember years ago, the Houston Astrodome was an amazing venue. I mean, there was no venue like it at the time. And now, at the time of its demise, it had become relatively small related to venues like that. But there were some pictures of on the internet of the abandoned inside of the Astrodome, and it was just sad. Down in Birmingham, is it Caraway Medical Center? Is that the one that looks like it ought to have a horror movie shot in it? I mean, you know, at one time you had a nice hospital facility, and then it was abandoned, and it's just, and so the picture here is that of an abandoned city, and that's what's being put in the vision for us. For all the nations, verse 3, have drunk the wine of the passion of her immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed acts of immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich by the wealth of her sensuality. And so the reasons given for her fall might have helped awaken an uneasiness in the readers, John's earliest readers, because remember when we were studying the 7 churches that this was addressed to, some of them had maybe tendencies toward fornicating with the harlot, for lack of a better way of saying it, maybe buying into some of what was being offered in order to not have to deal with maybe some of the hardships that could have been imposed on them. Fornicating being this metaphor for practices that violated relationships with God and the Lamb. I'll take part in these feasts that I ought not, because if I do that, then I can live and I can make money, and even though I'm actually maybe violating my relationship with God. And so eating meat sacrificed to idols had been indicated as a form of fornication. That's chapter 2, verses 14 and 20. And then it talks here about those who had grown rich from the power of Rome's luxury. Christians in Laodicea fell into that category, chapter 3, verse 17. Verse 4, I heard another voice from heaven saying, "Come out of her, my people, so that you will not participate in her sins and receive her plagues." So the call to come out speaks specifically to readers maybe who are being lulled into the complacency, by their prosperity, or who find compromising the integrity of their faith to be a reasonable price to pay for favors offered by the empire. I compromise my faith a little bit, but look what that gets me. He also reminds us that this call to come out, it's not meant as a physical departure, a physical leaving of the city. After all, the original audiences, were they in Rome? The original readers? Well, no, they're in Asia Minor. And so it's about disassociating themselves from the infidelity and the materialism that were hallmarks of the great city's trade. Instead, follow the ways of the Lamb. And so it was this idea of leaving Babylon emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually. That's kind of the way Roper put it. Roper also quotes Mounce here, who reminds us that the call to separation has marked the elect through the history of God's redemptive activity. In other words, if we're going to be followers of God, His expectation has always been that we come out and be separate. We still live in the world. We're still part of the world. But it's 2 Corinthians 6, verse 17, which quotes Isaiah 52. The Christians at Corinth are commanded to come out from their midst and be separate and do not touch what's unclean. And so even though we live in the world, we live in a way that shows that we are not of the world, in the sense that we no longer are going to buy into some of the things that the world's about. And so it's a choice that has to be made in one way or another for us every day. Every day of life, we make a choice about whether we're going to come out and be separate as we live life here. And so as we go through this, it's one of those things it's a great reminder for our need to self-examine as it relates to our relationship with our culture. So he says, come out and be separate so that you'll not participate in her sins and receive of her plagues. And then verse 5 says, for her sins have piled up as high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. And so this word picture of the volume of sin that Rome's been involved in. Verse 6, pay her back, even as she has been paid, or even as she has paid, and give back to her double according to her deeds. In the cup which she has mix twice as much for her. And so it's this payback talk. Rome was to be given back twice as much pain as she had dispensed. Roper says a principle of sowing and reaping is that a man reaps more than he sows. And Rome certainly deserved anything she got. Verse 7, and we see a word here, or a form of a word for a second time in this chapter. To the degree that she glorified herself and lived sensuously, to the same degree give her torment and mourning, for she says in her heart, I sit as a queen, and I'm not a widow, and will never see mourning. So the word sensuously, you see a form of it in verse 3, here in verse 7, going to see a form of it again in verse 9. And it's from a Greek word that we only find being used in these 3 verses in the New Testament. It's the only place you find this word. And so in thinking about the word sensuously, Roper quotes Beck, who states that these words contain the idea of excessive luxury and self-indulgence with accompanying arrogance and wanton exercise of strength. And so it's a big word in this chapter. Also a word from Warren Wiersbe. This Greek word suggests living proudly in luxury while others go without. It means to make possessions and pleasures the most important things in life and to ignore the needs of others. And so when in the Bible here it says that Rome is living sensuously, that gives you an idea of what this city and what this culture is about. And then in her arrogance saying, I sit as a queen and never as a widow. That's a quotation that goes back to Isaiah 47. But in the biblical world, was it a good thing to be a widow? In the first century, like for these folks, is it good to be a widow? Why not? Right. The widow was the epitome of poverty often, helplessness, and sometimes we'll see that today in our culture, and that's why in the church, there are specific instructions in our New Testament regarding how the church is supposed to take care of widows in certain situations who are members of the church family, although sometimes it's not bad for widows today. Sometimes they're fine. Sometimes they have plenty, but sometimes they are in want. But in this time, a widow she says, I'll never be a widow. I'll never be in poverty. I'll never be helpless. And what do we say about using the word never? Not a great word to use, right? Because you can have to eat that word sometimes. So I'll never die, nor will my children ever die, she says. But then verse 8 says, for this reason, in one day, her plagues will come, pestilence and mourning and famine, and she will be burned up with fire, for the Lord God who judges her is strong. In one day, not a 24-hour period. In this chapter, the term one day is going to be used interchangeably with what we'll see in verse 10 when it mentions 1 hour. Both terms here are symbolically being used to underline the relative suddenness of Rome's collapse. And I say relative because it is going to take some time. And then the comment, for the Lord who judges her is strong. And Roper comments here on how difficult, and probably not even able for us to wrap our minds around this, but how difficult it would have been for the original 7 churches, and maybe others who ultimately read this letter in that time. How do we wrap our minds around the demise of Rome? That's what we want, but it had to be something that was very hard for them to even imagine coming to pass, because Rome is so powerful. But God is strong. You know, you think about today, politically, there are certain things we maybe would love to see happen, but some things that we would like to see happen may seem like pipe dreams to us, like they could never happen. And when you think that way, that had to be how some of these original readers were hearing this. The fall of Rome, really, that's what we want, but man, how could it ever be? People in the Ukraine might think that way about Russia right now, right? How could Russia ever be eliminated or brought to its knees, or, you know, at a point where they wouldn't oppress us anymore? That's how people on our world might think about something like that today. And so John, the Holy Spirit through John's pen, is trying to get them to wrap their minds around the idea that yes, God is saying Rome is going to fall. So now we move to the lament, the mourners. And we're going to see, Kester notes the chapter mentions 3 groups of mourners. They're going to be the kings of the earth, that's verses 9 and 10. The merchants, verses 11 through 16. The shipmasters and sailors is verses 17 through 19. And so rather than these being words of judgment, these 3 groups, they're going to stand at a distance and they're going to speak words of grief. And it's more of a eulogy whereby they list the many splendors of the late great city. And one of the quotes here, he says, by exhibiting a more sympathetic attitude toward the harlot, the mourners give readers a way to examine their own viewpoints. How do I see the fall of Rome? If I'm an original, you know, am I going to see this the way they do, or am I going to see this the way God wants me to see it? So 9 and 10, we notice the kings of the earth. And the kings of the earth who committed acts of immorality and lived sensuously with her, there's our third use of that word, will weep and lament over her when they see the smoke of her burning. That's why they're standing at a distance. You know, when something's on fire, you got to stand back. Standing at a distance because of the fear of her torment, saying, woe, woe, the great city Babylon, the strong city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. And so when they mourn the loss of the city, what they're actually mourning is the loss of an illicit and self-indulgent relationship. Remember, they've been mentioned back in chapter 17, verse 2. In other words, as much as anything, they're mourning their own loss. We've lost this illicit relationship we've had with this city. You remember how Babylon, the power of Rome, funded so many others other puppet rulers, if you will. And so they're standing at a distance. Once they'd sought intimacy with the great harlot, now they stand at a distance. No attempt to rescue her in her time of trouble. And so then we look at the merchants. That's verses 11 through 16. And the merchants of the earth, they weep and mourn over her because no one buys their cargoes anymore. Cargoes of gold and silver and precious stones and pearls and fine linen and purple and silk and scarlet and every kind of citron wood, and every article of ivory, and every article made from very costly wood, and bronze, and iron, and marble, and cinnamon, and spice, and everything. Oh, it doesn't say everything nice. And incense, and perfume, and frankincense, and wine, and olive oil, and fine flour, and wheat, and cattle, and sheep, and cargoes of horses, and chariots, and slaves, and human lives. Is there a common theme to all of these commodities that are mentioned here? Are they the staples of life? It's luxury items. I mean, nobody's going to buy their stuff anymore, and what they're selling, it's not the basics you need to get by. What they're selling are the fineries of life. And so, you know, they're lost, they're mourning again. It has to do with self-interest. We've just lost losing the harlot means we've just lost our source of income. And it's luxury items. It's similar to Ezekiel's lamentation over Tyre in Ezekiel 27. And so one of the themes that runs through this chapter is the rank selfishness from these people who are affected by the fall. And they don't really care, this hurts me. Perhaps the epitome of selfishness, though, is the very last thing that's mentioned, because the slave trade is mentioned in verse 13. It says, and cargoes of horses and chariots and slaves and human lives. Commenting on the wording of the text, Roper notes that slave owners thought they owned people body and soul. He quotes Marin Franzman, who referred to this as the harshest word spoken on slavery in the New Testament. And sometimes people have a problem with the Bible because it's, slavery existed. It acknowledges that it existed. It doesn't maybe come down as hard on it as people would like for it to. But it was in practice, and what God's trying to do is save us from our sins, and so He doesn't always weigh in on everything that goes on in the world. But you do get Him kind of weighing in on it here, and really to get an appreciation for what's going on in the Roman Empire. I wasn't aware of these kinds of numbers, but it's been estimated that 1/3 of Rome's population was enslaved. And it was not unusual for 10,000 human beings to be auctioned off in one day. Mickey was talking about working cattle this morning, and when you could go, you do how many at one point a day? How many cattle a day at one point? 200 or 300 a day, and that was a good day. And they're saying it wasn't uncommon for them to auction off 10,000 people in a day. They say likely there were over 60 million slaves throughout the empire, people who were treated like pieces of furniture, bought and sold, used and abused. And so that's going away. They're losing that as well. So why was life so good for the merchants? Roper shares a few stories about the decadent lifestyles that were being lived in Rome. Nero's banquets. The Egyptian roses alone cost nearly $100,000 in today's, dollars. That's insane. I mean, flowers are insanely expensive. $100,000 worth of flowers. Vitellius, and I may not be saying his name right, loved his delicacies, and two delicacies that were mentioned were peacock's brains, so I don't know if that sounds good to you, and nightingale's tongues. And I didn't look, a nightingale can't have a very large tongue, right? I don't even know how you'd be able to maybe taste it. Anyway, in his reign of less than 1 year, he spent the equivalent of $20 million mostly on food, okay? One Roman, after squandering an immense fortune, committed suicide because he saw no way to live on the pittance which remained, which was about $300,000 of dollars in our way of thinking about it today. And so he's just kind of trying to paint us a picture of what's going on in the Roman Empire at the highest levels of luxury. And if you're one of these merchants, well, there's no wonder you're sad and upset when Rome falls and you lose your ability to make money in the way you did before. 17 through 20, we get the shipmasters and sailors. For in 1 hour, such great wealth has been laid waste. There's the 1 hour term, again, a relatively brief period of time. And every shipmaster and every passenger and sailor, and as many as make their living by the sea, stood at a distance and were crying out as they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, "What city is like the great city?" And they threw dust on their heads and were crying out, weeping and mourning, saying, "Woe, woe, the great city, in which all who had ships at sea became rich by her wealth. For in 1 hour she's been laid waste. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, because God has pronounced judgment for you against her." So, again, Kester refers to this lament as an exercise in self-pity. Weeping for her. In weeping for her, they're weeping for their bank accounts. We see something we are familiar with from our study of the Bible. When you're mourning, you did what with dust? Threw it on your head. And so they're in mourning. They're going through the process of mourning over this.
This morning, what you spoke on, when he came to the battlefield, he threw dust up on his head.
Right. Yeah, there's so much more in those texts from this morning, and that Doug read through it all, and there's so much more there than you can get through in one longer than it needed to be sermon. So I know I ran a little long this morning, but so Rome here in this chapter is pictured as a city swept by fire and smoke, an image, he says, which is fitting for the judgment of God. And then in verse 20 it talks about, this is judgment for you. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, because God has pronounced judgment for you on your behalf, in your favor, against her. So the last section of the chapter is the angel's prediction. That's Roper's heading. Then a strong angel, and that's an interesting statement. I didn't know angels were, I figured they were all similar in regard to strength, but this is a strong angel, and probably described that way because of the act that's going on in the vision. Then a strong angel took up a stone, like a great millstone, and threw it into the sea, saying, so will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence and will not be found any longer. Any of y'all watching the videos where they throw large objects off of bridges into water? I mean, and when the large object hits the water, it's amazing, isn't it? But if you look at the water a few minutes later, what does the water look like? Looks like nothing ever happened, because the object that was thrown in has gone to the bottom and the water's back to like it was. And that's kind of the picture being painted here, this great millstone being thrown into the sea, down with violence, and then it's just not found any longer because the water calms again and it's just gone. Verse 22, and the sound of harpists and musicians and flute players and trumpeters will not be heard in you any longer. And no craftsman of any craft will be found in you any longer. And the sound of a mill will not be heard in you any longer. It's that idea of what was once a city is now like a ghost town. And the light of a lamp will not shine in you any longer. And the voice of the bridegroom and bride will not be heard in you any longer. For your merchants were the great men of the earth, because of all the nations were deceived by your sorcery. And in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints and all who've been slain on the earth. And so, any longer, those two words, 6 times are repeated here in this paragraph, this section. Possibly used 6 times, Roper states, to symbolize and emphasize the failure of Rome. The structure of the Greek is stronger than the English translation of it. The Greek's way would have been, it would have kind of been saying never, never, never. I mean, it's over in that sense. But then verse 24, the angel explains to the audience, to the mourners, why this sentence has been imposed on Babylon. He exposes her secret. Yes, you helped a lot of people make a lot of money, and you had your thumb on a lot of things, but the secret is her splendor was purchased through deception, sorcery, the blood of prophets and of saints, and all who've been slaughtered on the earth. In other words, they weren't just slaughtering followers of Jesus. There were a lot of other people who were abused in this. And then Roper notes that according to uninspired tradition, when we talk about in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints and all who've been slain on the earth, uninspired tradition says by the time Revelation is written, all the apostles were gone except John. Now, if you're an early dater, you might have a different take there. What literally happened to Rome, and it's good that this is shared here, because this is talking about Rome's destruction and her demise, and all of that occurred, yet Rome still exists today. And so what literally happened to Rome? And it's the bustling capital of Italy today. So Roper shares this from Metzger. He says, as with so many judgment of God, the fulfillment actually came a bit slowly, but at last suddenly. For centuries, Rome decayed and degenerated, moral poison infecting her whole of life. Then during a fateful week in August of the year 410, Alaric, with his northern herds of Goths, pillaged Rome and laid it waste. Roper then continues and adds that later in 455, the Vandals ravaged the city for 2 weeks. Finally, in 476, the German chief Odoacer, I may be saying that wrong, I'm sure I am, ousted the last Roman emperor once and for all, putting an end to the empire as it had been known. And so it is described as suddenly, but it is going to take some time. And Kester points out that Babylon's fall, it's a tapestry. It's a tapestry woven from threads taken from many periods of time. If you're reading this and you're really familiar with your Old Testament, you've got echoes of the threats against Tyre from Ezekiel 26 through 28. You've got the threats against Babylon that were Jeremiah 50 and 51. And then some allusions to some other texts as well. The city's fall and desolation, Isaiah 21. Isaiah 13, Babylon's sins heaped high as heaven, Jeremiah 51, also chapter 16, Jeremiah 51, verses 9, 16, and 18. Her boast that she would never be a widow comes out of Isaiah 47. The list of the trade goods, Ezekiel 27, symbolizing her destruction by throwing a stone into the sea, Jeremiah 51. Silencing the sounds of the bride and the groom, Jeremiah 25. And Kester says this is just a partial list of the allusions stating that others could be added. And so he goes on to say, while readers would have first identified this with Rome, with all of these allusions, it helps bring to mind a bigger point, something that's not confined in time or just in place of Rome. It's a principle of God that if you're against God, eventually you're going to pay for that. Roper points out that these allusions to Old Testament terminology would have helped accomplish something else for first century readers. He says it would have reminded them and it would have reinforced the concept that Old Testament predictions had come to pass exactly as God had promised. As such, they were reassured that if God said Rome would fall, she would fall. In other words, if you're drawing on wording and prophecies of the past that had already happened, and now God is saying that this is going to happen to Rome, that should build your confidence that it's going to happen, even though in the moment maybe it's hard to see how Rome could ever fall because they're so powerful. And so Rome was the first city to have 1 million inhabitants, and after it fell, London was the next city to hit 1 million some 1,600 years later. And that was from Jeremy Barrier when he was teaching Revelation. And when you think about it that way, that's pretty powerful as well. And so that is chapter 18. Anything you all want to add related to the chapter? Any questions you want us to research for next time? It is pretty straightforward in talking about the fall. And not a whole lot here that you've got to do a bunch of trying to figure out, well, what's he really talking about? Or at least my take on it that way. Does seem to be one of the easier chapters to think through. But anything to add? Okay.
Look, if you look historically at that, it changed the world into what we call the Dark Ages.
Right.
At least in Western civilization, which I guess lasted for 1,000 years.
Yeah.
So it's funny that see that came from God, but it changed the world some. But we look at it maybe as it sent the world back.
Right.
Maybe it did start commerce.
It may have. And that may have been the reset God decided was needed. That's a good point. That's a good point. Right. Romans 12. You want me to read it? Romans 12, 17 through 19. Never pay back evil for evil to anyone. Respect what is right in the sight of all men. If possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. Never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Hang in there. Absolutely. Don't give up. Good point. Good point. And that's 17 through 19 is hard for us even today. hard for us even today. Wanted to run somebody off the road on the way to church. Kidding. That road rage thing, it'll get you. But Romans 12 is a great chapter. I mean, there is so much. It's just a great chapter. It really is. All right. Anything else? Yes. Okay. Really? The barbarian tribe that took Rome in 476 were Christians. Did not know that. So this is why I regret any week that Tim can't be here with us and any week that Hudson can't be, because their knowledge of history is amazing to me. And so I appreciate you sharing that. That's great. Well, Lord willing, 2 weeks from now we'll be in Romans 19. No, we will not. Because 2 weeks from tonight we'll be in VBS, right? Is that right? Singing next week, and then we'll be in VBS 2 weeks from tonight. So we will not be doing Revelation next Sunday night, 2 weeks from now.